A shocking death rocks a quiet English village. 5 hidden clues could reveal the killer. Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator Falcon. Where are you joining us from today? I can't wait to read your thoughts. Let's begin. Episode 1, The Crime.
Evening all. Fine night, isn't it?
Aye, it is. And how's the family? Very well, thank you. Busy as always.
Good to hear.
The scream came just as the vicar began to pour the tea. For a brief moment, the pleasant murmur of conversation at Rosewood Manor froze into silence. Cups hovered halfway to lips. A spoon clattered onto a saucer. And in that instant, Miss Marple noticed something rather curious. While the others turned toward the sound in alarm, one guest did not look surprised at all. Rosewood Manor stood at the edge of the peaceful village of Little Brackford, surrounded by gentle hills, tidy hedgerows, and the sort of quiet respectability that English villages seem to cultivate like roses. On that particular afternoon, the gardens of the manor were filled with polite society. The annual Little Brackford Charity Garden Tea was a cherished tradition. Tables draped with pale linen dotted the lawn, each decorated with small bowls of roses from the manor's famous gardens. The villagers had gathered in their finest summer attire to support the restoration of St. Michael's church roof. At the center of the event stood the host himself. Arthur Penberry, owner of Rosewood Manor. He was a tall man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and a voice that carried comfortably across the lawn. Arthur Penberry had lived in Little Brackford for nearly 20 years and was widely respected as a generous benefactor. Though, as Miss Marple often said, generosity sometimes concealed other motives. Arthur moved among the guests with polished charm, laughing warmly and complimenting the vicar's wife on the lemon cakes. "Splendid turnout this year," he remarked. "Quite splendid," replied Inspector Harold Finch, who had attended the event purely as a guest, not in any official capacity. A large man with thoughtful eyes, Finch had been stationed in the nearby town for several years and was well known to the villagers. Nearby sat Miss Jane Marple, quietly knitting beside a small table of cucumber sandwiches. She had been invited by her friend Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, the manor's housekeeper. Miss Marple had the appearance of someone who might miss very little while appearing to notice almost nothing. Her knitting needles clicked gently. Her eyes moved slowly over the gathering. Little Brackford was, after all, much like St. Mary Mead, and human nature tended to repeat itself with remarkable consistency. Among the guests were several individuals Miss Marple had been discreetly observing. There was Dr. Leonard Hale, the village physician, a serious man with a calm manner who spoke little but watched everything. Close by stood Clara Penberry, Arthur's young second wife. She was elegant and striking, nearly 20 years younger than her husband, and dressed in pale blue silk that fluttered softly in the warm breeze. Clara smiled often, though her eyes occasionally flickered with something sharper. Then there was Jonathan Blake, Arthur Penberry's business partner from London. Blake had arrived only the day before and possessed the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to negotiations rather than village gossip. At the far end of the lawn sat Margaret Dalloway, Arthur's niece. Margaret had been living at Rosewood Manor since the death of her parents several years earlier. She was pale and reserved, with thoughtful dark eyes that followed her uncle carefully. And finally, moving quietly among the tables with a tray of tea, was Thomas Reed, the manor's long-serving gardener. His face was weathered from years outdoors, and though he spoke politely when addressed, he seemed uncomfortable among the elegant guests. Miss Marple noticed that Thomas Reed never came too close to Arthur Penberry. Interesting. As the afternoon progressed, the atmosphere remained cheerful. The vicar gave a short speech about community spirit. Mrs. Whitcomb supervised the serving of cakes with military efficiency. Children chased one another between the rose bushes. And yet, beneath the gentle charm of the occasion, something felt slightly strained. Miss Marple could not have explained it exactly. But there were small signs. Arthur Penberry had argued quietly with Jonathan Blake near the veranda earlier. Miss Marple had not heard the words, but Blake's face had turned an unpleasant shade of red before he forced a smile and walked away. Later, Clara Penberry had been seen speaking urgently to Dr. Hale beside the Rose Arch. And Margaret Dalloway had spent much of the afternoon watching her uncle with what looked suspiciously like resentment. Village gatherings were excellent places for observing human behavior. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their calm rhythm. The moment came shortly after 5 o'clock. The vicar's wife had just poured a fresh pot of tea. Arthur Penberry stood beside the fountain, raising his cup with cheerful ceremony. "To the good people of Little Brackford," he declared. Laughter followed. Cups were lifted. And then the scream shattered the afternoon. It came from inside the house. A young maid burst through the veranda doors, white as chalk. "Mr. Penberry," she gasped. "Sir, please, come quickly." The guests exchanged startled glances. Arthur frowned. What on earth? But before he could finish the sentence, a second cry echoed from the house. This one was louder. Panic spread instantly across the lawn. Inspector Finch rose at once. "Everyone stay where you are," he said firmly. "I'll see what's happened." Arthur Penberry followed him through the open doors, several others trailing behind despite the inspector's instructions. Miss Marple did not hurry. She folded her knitting neatly into her bag and rose with quiet interest. In her experience, sudden commotion often revealed the most telling reactions. The drawing room of Rosewood Manor was cool and dim compared with the bright garden outside. Several servants stood gathered near the doorway. And on the polished oak floor, beside the drinks cabinet, Arthur Penberry lay dead. His body had collapsed awkwardly against a small table. A crystal glass lay shattered nearby. Inspector Finch knelt immediately. Dr. Hale stepped forward to examine the body. There was a tense silence. Finally, Dr. Hale looked up. "I'm afraid he's gone," he said quietly. Clara Penberry gave a soft cry. Margaret Dalloway covered her mouth. Jonathan Blake stared at the body with wide, stunned eyes. "Heart attack," someone whispered. Dr. Hale shook his head slowly. "No. I don't believe so." Inspector Finch picked up the broken glass carefully. A faint bitter smell lingered in the air. "Poison," he said grimly. The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Poison. In Little Brackford. At a charity tea. Inspector Finch rose and addressed the group firmly. "No one leaves the manor until we understand what's happened." A servant was sent to telephone the police station. The guests were escorted back to the garden. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, her eyes thoughtful. Poison, she reflected, was rarely an impulsive crime. It suggested planning, patience, and motive. She glanced toward the drinks cabinet. A tray of glasses still stood there. One was missing. Another detail caught her eye. A faint smear of red rose pollen marked the edge of the cabinet. Miss Marple frowned slightly. That was rather odd. The roses in the garden had been carefully arranged in bowls. Why would pollen be on the drinks cabinet inside the house? Her gaze moved slowly around the room. And then she noticed something else. Thomas Reed, the gardener, stood near the doorway. He looked pale. But he wasn't staring at the body. He was staring at Clara Penberry. And Clara, Miss Marple observed, seemed very carefully avoiding his eyes. Outside, the garden had fallen into anxious whispers. Inspector Finch began questioning the guests. "When did Mr. Penberry last have a drink?" he asked. Margaret spoke first. "He came inside a few minutes before the speech," she said. "I think he said he wanted a sherry." Jonathan Blake nodded. "Yes. I saw him go into the drawing room." Clara Penberry's voice trembled slightly. "I assumed he was fetching another bottle." Inspector Finch looked thoughtful. So the poison must have been placed in his drink while he was alone. Miss Marple, listening quietly nearby, shook her head almost imperceptibly. People, she reflected, often made the mistake of assuming the obvious explanation must be correct. But human beings were rarely so simple. Her eyes drifted toward the house again. Toward the rose bushes near the veranda doors. And suddenly she remembered something. Just 10 minutes earlier, she had seen someone leaving the house. Someone carrying a small garden pruning knife. At the time, it had seemed entirely innocent. But now, Miss Marple folded her hands gently. She turned toward Inspector Finch. "Inspector," she said politely. "Yes, Miss Marple? I wonder if it might interest you to know that shortly before Mr. Penberry's speech." She paused. "I saw someone leaving the drawing room rather quickly." The inspector's eyes sharpened. "Who?" Miss Marple looked across the garden. Directly at one of the guests. And at that exact moment, that person realized she had been seen. Their face drained of color. Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Why, Inspector?" It was Jonathan Blake. And as the entire garden turned toward him, Jonathan Blake slowly backed away. Then suddenly ran.